So if you look at this application lifecycle management, the process starts from planning, development, testing, building the release, testing that release, and finally it is going to the production here. So at no point there are no direct changes that are made to the production here. If you look at this production, it is a live environment. When I say live environment, it is nothing but an application that is used by the end users. End users are the people who are using this application. That means there would be a live data and there would be a live transactions that would be happening here. So any changes that we do directly into the production might cause some issues / bugs, or any change that is working as expected might come as a surprise to the people who are already used with the current process. So that is why any new changes that are into the production might cause a kind of a disconnect for the users who are already used with that process, or at times there might be some bugs or there might be some issues that might not be properly tested and found out in this process if we directly make those changes into the production. So that is why anytime any direct changes into the production is something that is not encouraged. So the process that we need to take is, first we need to do it in another area or another place which is kind of disconnected with the production. First we would make our changes, or we would go ahead and build our user stories or your requirements. We would go ahead and build our user stories and our requirements in a separate area or a place which is disconnected from our production. Any changes into this particular place or a box might not impact our production. So we want such boxes wherein which we can go ahead and test it and develop our changes and see how it looks like, give a demo to our client. Once it is approved, that is where we will proceed with the deployment to the production. So we wanted an area which is kind of disconnected or isolated from our production org. So that kind of a box or a place where we can go ahead and make those changes and test it, see the output, and then demonstrate to the client, and can also be used for the training. That box is nothing but our sandbox. So this is how our sandbox comes into picture. So let's understand what is a sandbox. We have just understood or realized why we need a sandbox. We need a sandbox so that we can disconnect from the production, or we can have a sandbox, or we can have an area where in which we can go ahead and develop, test it, and kind of use it for training the users so that they are aware of the latest changes. So why a sandbox is needed? We need sandbox for development, testing, and for training the users. So we have understood the reason why we need a sandbox. Let's understand what exactly the sandbox is. Now, just to iterate the idea of a sandbox, right? So to put the points together, why we need a sandbox? We need a sandbox for these reasons: to isolate the customization and development work from the production. This is the main need of our sandbox. To summarize these things and put in points why we need a sandbox, here it goes. The first and foremost important point that we have here is sandbox is mainly used for isolate customization and the development work from our production environment until unless you are ready to deploy those changes. This is the fundamental reason why a sandbox is being used. If I directly do it in production, I might introduce some bugs, or anything that I make a change might come as a surprise to the users, which we have discussed previously. We do not want that to happen. We wanted to make sure that we are doing it in a sandbox, get it properly tested by a QA team, and then showcase it as a demo to a client. And once they're happy, once they're trained with the latest changes, that is where we wanted to move it to the production environment. So this is the main reason why we need a sandbox. The second important reason here is test the changes against the copies of your production data and users. So why this is important? Let's say I've built a functionality. It is working with the test data, but what I've not checked is whether it is working with the actual data or not. If I'm just testing with the test data and I wanted to be double sure that the same changes or the same development that I've done is also working with the actual data, that is where I will be taking the copies of the production data and the users to test this functionality to have an assurance that it also works with the production data that we have in our production environment. So this is the second most important reason why a sandbox is being created, so that they can test with the production data in a sandbox. Anything that we do in a sandbox would remain in sandbox itself. Third and important reason why we use a sandbox is for training. Why we need training? As we discussed here, as a developer, We might know the functionality. As a BA or a technical architect, they might know about the functionality and the development that is happening. A QA team would also know about the functionality, but nowhere here client would be knowing the functionality here. He might have given the functionality, but he doesn't know how this functionality is being implemented in this Salesforce. So once we move these changes to the production without getting an approval from the client, it might come as a surprise to them. So that is why we wanted to give them a kind of a demo, and also not just one person who has to see this demo. There should be some bunch of people who will actually use this environment once it is live. We want to also train them so that it would be easier for them to use this application once it is live. So that is one more reason why a sandbox is needed. To summarize things, we'll be using the sandbox for our development needs, for testing needs, and also for training. Now comes the part wherein which we need to understand what is a sandbox. So now let's understand what is a sandbox here. Sandboxes creates a copy of our Salesforce or in a separate environment. Use them for development, testing, training without compromising the data and the application in your production. Or in case if somebody asks why we need a sandbox or what is the need of a sandbox or what is a sandbox, you can simply tell them that it helps us create a copies of our sandbox. And if they ask us why, it is used for our development, testing, and training. Most important point that we all need to keep in mind is it helps us do this process without compromising the data that is there in your production, and also without compromising the application that is already in our production. No one wants to deploy any changes into the production which might cause some issues to the end users. So that is where the sandbox comes to the rescue. You can visualize your sandbox like this. It is a play area where you can try, develop things. That means you can start building your castle here, test it if it withstands with the wind and everything, and also train people on how to do it. And you can play around with your friends and build requirements here, test it, and also train it in this sandbox. So that is what exactly is a sandbox is. Now let's understand what all types of sandboxes that we have and what is the storage limit and what are the things that we need to keep in mind for a given sandbox. We have understood the reason why we need to create a sandbox. We have understood what is a sandbox. Now is the time where we need to decide what all kinds of sandboxes that we have, and we'll understand which kind of a sandbox is apt for a particular requirement. Remember, we have talked about sandbox is used for development, testing, and also training people. Let's look at the types of sandboxes. There are like 4 kinds of sandboxes here. First one is a developer sandbox. Second one is a developer pro sandbox. Third one is a partial copy sandbox. And fourth one is a full copy sandbox. Now let's look at the comparison between these 4 sandboxes and understand which sandbox is used for what all reasons. Now, if you look at this sandbox, it basically includes configuration, Apex and metadata, and all users. Remember, we'll be creating a sandbox so that we can use it for different reasons like development, testing, and training. Now, in order to develop a requirement, if I do not have the previous changes in developer sandbox, it would be very difficult for a developer to assume those changes and implement on top of it. So that is why whenever we get a sandbox, we also want the previous changes to be there in that sandbox, which are there in production, so that we can build on top of that. So a development process would be a kind of a process where in which we develop on something that is already there. If nothing is there, we would start from scratch. If there is something that is already in the production, we wanted to make sure that we add on top of that. Why? Because we also want to make sure that the latest changes that we are doing here is not breaking the existing one, and it is going in hand with the previous changes that are there in the production. Now for that, if I do not have the configurations and the customizations that are there already in the production in my sandbox, it would be very difficult for me to start building everything from scratch and carry on with the latest requirement. So that is why whenever you have this sandboxes, you would be getting this configuration, Apex and metadata, and all users from your production. So this is your developer sandbox. When we'll be using our developer sandbox, we'll be using our developer sandbox for our dev need. So whenever there is a need for development, we'd be using the sandbox license, which is nothing but a developer sandbox license for our developer needs. So this sandbox is ideally used for developer. Now, if you look at the capacity of this sandbox, it is having 200 MB. Now, the next version that we have is a developer pro sandbox. Again, the name suggests it is mainly meant for development needs. Again, it is also used for developer needs. Now, what is the difference between this developer sandbox and developer pro sandbox? The capacity is the limit here. Again, it also includes the configuration, apex and metadata, and all the users that is coming in from production. If you ask me what is the difference between a developer sandbox and a developer pro sandbox, the comparison between these two things comes in terms of capacity. If the team size is too large and there are like too many developers who are working on that particular sandbox, it is always suggested to have a bigger limit here. That is where it is suggested to move with the developer pro sandbox. Sandbox that we have is a partial copy. Again, it says partial copy. That means we are taking something in partial and we are also kind of copying something. Right? So let's see what exactly we have. So what exactly this partial copy sandbox would include? It would have the configurations just like the other sandboxes. It also has apex and the metadata. It also has the list of users from production. Interestingly, these are the two items that are absent in our previous sandboxes. That is nothing but records. That means the data from production will be coming into your sandbox. Partial copy is one of the sandbox where in which you can get the data from your production. And it says sample of selected objects. That means this partial implies here we are getting a partial copy of records from our production into our sandbox. If you ask me why, we need certain functionality to be tested with the real data so that we are sure that it is working as expected. We might not be sending an emails to the customers. We have to be careful at that point, but we wanted to test it with the real data and see if it is actually working as expected or not. Now, we have a sandbox template support here. In order to get this data from our production into our sandbox, there is a template support that is available for us. So what exactly is this template and how is that helping us copy the information that is from there? What exactly is this sandbox template and how can we get this information from our production into our sandbox is something that we'll keep it aside for time being. And we'll discuss this template concept in our coming slides. Now, if you look at the capacity of a partial copy, it is 5 GB. 5 GB is comparatively more than the other sandboxes that we have seen so far. Now, let's look at the full copy sandbox. It's mainly meant for having a kind of a replica of your production. It is an exact copy of your production. Now, let's look at the things that we have in our full copy sandbox. Just like the other sandboxes, you will be getting the configuration, you'll be getting the apex metadata, you'll be getting all the users, you'll be getting records, that to all records or the selected objects. In case if you want very specific objects to be copied, you can do that, or you can also get the full copy. That means all the records that are there in the production would be copied onto your sandbox. It also has a template support here so that you can decide. You do not have to select your objects again and again. You can reuse your template. Once configured, you can reuse your template in copying your changes from your production to your sandbox. In case if you want the history and the charter data, you can also get it into your full copy sandbox, which is an optional. Now, if you see here, we have 4 types of sandboxes: developer sandbox, developer pro sandbox, partial copy, and a full copy. Now, we have looked at this developer sandbox and developer pro sandbox, and we have decided that it will be used for development needs. And now, if you ask me partial copy and full copy, where they are being used, you would use your partial copy for your QA needs, where in which you go ahead with your testing purposes. You would be using your full copy for your regression, or you would be using the full copy for your training. Depending on the number of full copies that the organization has, they would decide whether they want to use it for training or for regression. It is a client's call and the people who are implementing it so that they can decide what is the reason that they'll be using for full copy. At times, they can do the regression and the training in the full copy sandbox itself. Or if the company has more than one full copy, they can use one for regression, one for training. So that way they can keep the regression part separate and the training part separate. Now, if you look at this licensing part, whenever you have your production org, you can check the number of licenses that are given. So for this developer, for this org that I've taken a screenshot from, I have a developer sandbox. The number of sandboxes that are given to me is 25, out of which I've used 1. Again, I do not have any developer pro sandbox. That is why it is showing us 0, 0. And if you see, there was a 1 partial copy sandbox that is given to me and I've not used that. And finally, we have a full copy sandbox. As of now, it says 0, 0. That means I do not have access to create a full copy sandbox. In case if you need extra sandboxes, you can always reach out to the Salesforce support to get this sandboxes for us. So the only item that is pending here is this refresh cycle. For time being, I'll park this aside and we'll come back to this one once we complete our entire discussion. One important point to understand or to observe here is there is no capacity limit here for a full copy sandbox. It depends on your production, or because we are getting the entire data from our production. I'll be using an analogy to help you understand better what exactly this sandbox is that we have just discussed. There are 4 types of sandbox that we have looked at: developer sandbox, developer pro sandbox, partial copy, and full copy. So now let's say I'll be using this analogy of a pizza. So if you look at this pizza, it has a base, it has that cheese layer, and we have toppings here, different toppings, and also toppings 1, I would say, toppings 2, topping 3, toppings 4. So now if you see this pizza, it is looking good. It has that base, it has that cheese layer, we have a couple of toppings here. Now imagine this as a production org where we have all the items here. If you ask me, I wanted to create a developer sandbox. If I'm copying it here, I might not get everything here. Why? Because there are certain points that we have discussed in our previous slide, which basically talks about what are the things that you would be getting as a part of a developer sandbox. If you see here in this example of copying, you'll be getting the pizza base if you're copying, and you're getting the cheese layer here. You're not getting the extra toppings here because it is a developer sandbox that we're creating. You would be getting the configurations, apex, and metadata as a part of your developer sandbox along with your users. Even though I'm making a copying it from the production, I might not get everything here. I'm getting the base and the cheese layer. Try to imagine this point with our production org. So even though I'm asking the system to create a copy of it, it is just creating a piece of this kind. We are not having toppings here. That is totally fine because we are asking for a developer sandbox here. So system would only copy the things that are mentioned in our previous slide. That is nothing but your configurations and the apex and metadata changes along with the users. Now let's say if I ask for a partial copy sandbox, that means I'm asking the partial of a data, or I'm asking a specific records to be copied from my production to my partial copy. Again, if I ask the system to make a copy of it, what it is doing, it is giving me the base, and it is also giving me the cheese layer here. It is giving me the toppings. Ignore this other toppings that we have. For time being, let's assume that we have some toppings here. Not all, but some. We have some toppings here. Why only some? Because we have asked for a partial copy sandbox. We are not getting the exact copy, but we are getting the partial of the data that we have in our production. So if you see here, if we compare it with our normal discussion, we have our configuration changes, which is nothing but the base. We have our apex and metadata changes. You can think, or you can relate it to the cheese layer. On top of that, we are getting toppings here, which is nothing but record. Are we getting all the toppings here? No, we are getting only some. Why? Because it is a partial copy wherein which it copies the partial data. So you can decide what all toppings need to be copied from your production org. So that is nothing but your template that we'll be discussing shortly. So sandbox template would decide or would help you configure it for once, and you can reuse it whenever it is needed. Now comes the full copy sandbox. By now you might have guessed it right. Whenever we ask for a full copy sandbox, it is an exact clone copy of what exactly you have in your production. If you see, you have a base here, you have a cheese layer here, you have the topping 1, topping 2, topping 3, and the topping 4. So whatever that you have in your production is been a kind of a copy that is being created in your full copy set. So now, if you see this comparison, our developer sandbox is not looking like a production because we do not have a data here. Your partial copy is not kind of totally matching with your production because there is only a partial copy of a data that has been copied. But your full copy is kind of resonating or kind of having the exact replica of your production. So this is how we can basically understand the needs of it. By now, you might have got a kind of a basic understanding of what exactly this sandboxes would be like and what are the things that would be copied from the production.
Hey guys, if you like this video, do like, share and subscribe to SFDC Quest.